Alrighty, in this video, we're going to go ahead and hook up our user's admin to our database. So if you remember from a couple videos ago, I'm going to go ahead and launch my site by hitting Control F5. We do have a user's admin. So if we come up here, we can see our user's index and we can see our create user form. Currently, all it does is some server-side validation and has some fancy looking buttons. That's really about it. So we're going to go ahead and set this up so that when we actually create a user, it'll get saved to the database and we can actually see users in the user's index. We'll throw in some actions for editing a user and resetting their password. The only complex bit about what we're going to do is the roles. Now, remember that a user can be added to one or more roles, which is going to determine things like, can they access the game, can they log in, can they download the launcher, and can they perform administrative tasks. Of course, the way that the roles table is set up, we can add any additional roles that we want to in the future. So what I'm going to do first is I do want us to have an email address for our users, because when a user registers, we want them to be sent an email so that they can confirm their account. So we'll need to add an email property to our user's entity and create the corresponding migration for it. So I'm going to go up to buzzmmo.data, entities, user, and I'm going to add a new property for my email. So I'm going to say public string email get set. I'm going to set it to required, and I'm going to set the max length to, I don't know, 256. I mean, we're not going to want to, or let's set it to 128. And the reason I'm setting it to 128 is that we want to be able to index this field for particular queries. On our reset password page, for example, we'll need to search users by email. So yeah, we'll have to do that. Next up, we're going to go ahead and have to create the migration that'll be responsible for updating our database schema to reflect the property we just added. So go ahead and fire up your package manager console and initialize blah, 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 blah. There we go. And type in add migration. Let's call this add email to users. Hit enter. And this is going to fail because I just realized I did something. I didn't set the default project to buzzmmo.data, so I'm going to set that. Also remember, we definitely want the startup project to be buzzmmo.web so that it's going to be working against the database we configured in that project. So I'm going to say add migration, add email to users, and hit enter. Blah, 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 blah. And we have a migration. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is I want to go ahead and also add a index to the email. I want it to be indexed so that we can query it efficiently when we do our password reset. And what am I going to do? Also, I want email to be unique as well. So I want it to be unique and indexed. Unfortunately, I don't know how to do that when we use the add column method because, again, I'm kind of new to this migration framework. It's a little different than Fluent migrations. So I'm just going to look through the parameters to this real quickly. I don't see anything that says unique or index, so I'm going to back out into the add column method and see what we can add there. I don't see anything that we can add there either. Potentially, there may be an add index or maybe create index. There is a create index method. So we're going to want that. So I'm going to type in dbo.users, column email, and unique is true. Now I'm not going to want to set the name because it's going to generate the name for us. We're not going to worry about clustered, and we don't need to pass any anonymous arguments. So we can just leave it like that. So we add the column and we create the index. On our down, we don't have to worry about dropping the index because the index will be dropped when we drop the column. So make sure it's in this order. Another thing I want to point out is that we're doing dbo dot on everything. dbo is what's called a schema. Yes, it's a schema in MSSQL. Since we're not using MSSQL, the dbo dot is going to effectively be ignored when we use it against MySQL, but by adding it in there, it'll make it more compatible with SQL Server if that's the database engine that you are using. It'll also be present in all of the automatically created migrations. So we want to make sure that it's present just to be consistent with the generated code. But for our purposes, it'll be irrelevant. But again, just to be consistent and to make sure that this will work the way we expect it to if we use a different database engine, I'm going to leave that in there. So now we have the index and the column. We're ready to apply this migration. So we come back down here to our package manager console, and I'm going to say update-database. Wait a year and a half, or maybe longer. And Visual Studio is going to freeze. I think it's still working. There we go. Applying explicit migration, and running our seed method. Remember, our seed method on our configuration object is ran every time that we do our migration, or any migration. So I'm going to bring over MySQL Workbench and see if our change is present. So I'm going to right-click Users and say Alter Table. And we see that we do have an email field, and it is not set to unique, or it is set to unique, sorry, it's not set to unsigned. So it is that constraint did get created, and we can also check to make sure that constraint was created by going into indexes and seeing IX email unique has been created. I do want to point out one potential issue with what we just did. As you'll see in our users table, we only have one user present, and his email is blank. We're going to go ahead and fix that manually and update our seed method to correspond to the proper email. However, if you had multiple users and you perform the migration we just did, the combination of making email not null and adding a unique constraint to it will cause your migration to fail. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we had another user inside of our users table, and then we added a not null email field to it, both of their emails will get set to blank. Then, if we add a unique constraint to it, we won't be able to because two users will have the same email. As of right now, only one user exists, so the migration was successful. I just wanted to point that out for everyone. But since we haven't actually created the create user form yet, we don't really have any users that, well, we should have created by now. The only way to have added a user would be to have gone into the database and added it manually. So if you did that and you ran into an error while applying the migration, just go ahead and nuke your users table. I am going to go ahead and manually update this email though. Let's do admin@3dbuzz.com or something generic, and then I'm going to go down here and hit apply. And I'm also going to move this out of the way and update our seed method by saying email equals admin@3dbuzz.com. So you want to make sure to make both of those changes as well. Okay, so now that we have our email field and it has an index on it and that index is unique, let's go ahead and start on our create user form. Now it doesn't make much sense to create our index users form quite yet because we haven't been able to actually create users yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and scope my Solution Explorer down to buzzmmo.web. I find that to be very useful when working with projects with lots of solutions and limited vertical screen real estate. And you do that by right-clicking the project and saying Scope to this. If you click on that, you'll notice that all the other projects disappear, and we're now scoped to, in our Solution Explorer, this one project, which removes a lot of the vertical clutter. Alternatively, we could also right-click any of these items within the project and also say Scope to this if we wanted to, like only work with app start. To go back, you just use the back and forward buttons at the top. To go back to the top level Solution Explorer, you just click Home. But that's a nice little trick that will clean up our Solution Explorer a little bit while we're working on the website. And I'll use it quite often as we're moving forward, and I won't necessarily tell everyone that I did it. I just wanted to point it out one time here first. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to fill in our create. Now, our create form isn't quite finished yet. If we go into the actual view file, we'll notice there isn't a place for roles. Now, updating many-to-many relationships with ASP.NET MVC can be challenging, and there's a variety of ways of doing it. What I'm going to show is One of the more simpler ways of doing it, that also provides us enough flexibility to get it to display the way we want to, and prevent us from having to write a large amount of boilerplate code inside of our controller. So what do we want to do? Well, put simply, we want our create form to have a list of checkboxes for all the roles that we can add to the user. To do that, the first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to modify our view model to pass in a list of roles. Now, I see a lot of people, when they work with many-to-many relationships, use the view bag to pass in that data. We're not going to be using the view bag. We're going to try to keep things as strongly typed as possible. In fact, typically in production development, the only time I will use a view bag is to represent data that is global or used in a layout file. So let's go ahead and do that. I need some sort of list of user roles. Now, I could theoretically do public IEnumerable of roles. I could do this, but I'm not going to. And the reason I'm not going to is that passing in an entity that's used for persistence into a view model is a terrible, terrible practice that will inevitably result in probably death or insanity as you try to modify your application down the road. The point is that we actually have two representations of users and two representations of roles, and we'll have two representations of pretty much every piece of data that we're going to work with on the site. One of those representations being used for the database, the other one being used for the views. Getting those two concerns mixed up will prevent you from being able to extend either of those representations to fill a particular need. For example, well, it'd probably be a bad example. Well, no, this is a good example. If we use an IEnumerable of roles in our view model, we'll be pulling in an iCollection of users as well. We don't want that. In fact, the only thing we really want is ID and name, but we also want a Boolean indicating whether or not this role is enabled for the user that we're either creating or editing. So not only do we want to take data out that we don't need from the persistence model, but we also want to add data in that we only need for the view. The way to handle this sort of situation is to create, like I said before, a second representation of the same data that's fit for a different purpose. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to create another view model, and the view model is going to represent the concept of a role within the context of a user. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to open up my view model's namespace, and I'm going to add a class. And the class is going to be called user role. I'm going to hit enter. Now the user role class, we will need a name. The name is going to be the name of the role. We'll need a public int ID, which can be the ID of the role. And we'll need a public boolean is selected, which indicates if this particular role is checked for this particular user. And we'll pick up on this Boolean bit in our controller in order to set up the proper relationships between that particular user object and the roles that he is a part of or a member of. In addition, I'm going to create a constructor for convenience that'll include the name, the ID, and the is selected. I'm going to move the ID to the leftmost side. I like my IDs to be the first parameter to a constructor that accepts them. So we're going to create this constructor for convenience so that we can easily instantiate user roles without having to use object initialization syntax. In addition, there's one other thing I have to do to this view model. Now, like I said before, the purpose of this view model is to be used in ASP.NET MVC in our view files and in our controllers, which means the ASP.NET MVC model binder component will have to be able to understand how to create a new instance of user role. Now, we could override the default behavior, of course, as everything in ASP.NET MVC is extensible, but the default behavior is going to prevent us from being able to instantiate this particular object because it has a non-default constructor, a non-parameterless constructor. Basically, I said that all to say that we also need a parameterless constructor in our view model class Otherwise, ASP.NET MVC won't know how to instantiate it, because if we don't have this parameterless constructor, it's going to be looking at this constructor and being like, oh, hey, there's a bunch of parameters, I don't know how to fill them in, and then it'll throw an exception and the world will end. The reason we didn't have to add this empty constructor in beforehand is in C#, when you have a class that has no constructor, a constructor that looks like this, a parameterless empty constructor, is generated for you. But since we added in another constructor, that was no longer the case, and we have to put it in ourselves. Okay, so we now have our user role view model. Let's go ahead and hook that up into our users create view model. So I'm going to hop back over to users create, and I'm going to replace this generic type parameter to user role, so that we now have an IEnumerable of user role being passed into our user create form. Okay, so that's all well and good, but now we have two problems. First of all, how do we fill this data in? And second, how do we present this data to the user? Let's tackle the first problem first. Let's jump over to user controller. Now we'll see that we instantiate the users create view model right here in our create method. Well, to fill in our roles, we would have to use object initialization syntax and type in roles equals something. Now, of course, that's invalid syntax, but we'll fill in those question marks here in a moment. Now, what does roles need to be set to? Well, roles needs to be set to the result of querying for all of the roles in the system, and then transforming those database entities into my view models, my corresponding view model, which in this case is user role. So we need a connection to the database. Now, I could certainly open up a database connection right here and create, but instead I'm going to add a field to my users controller called database. So I'm going to say private read-only MMO database context, which will bring in, of course, buzzmmo.data at the top. And I'm going to say database equals new MMO database context. That's all we need to do to set up a connection to the database in our controller. Now, in a more architected, significantly better architected application, we of course would be receiving this database context from a constructor parameter that would be filled in with a dependency injection framework or IOC framework. But since we're not doing that here, we'll just instantiate it directly and it'll work and everyone will be happy. Now we have a connection to our database, which I don't know why I named it capital database. I should have named it like that. I got protected and private mixed up in my head a little bit. But yeah, we're going to name it with an underscore D. Now we have to fill in this. So how do we retrieve all the roles in our database and transform them into a list of our user roles? Well, I'm going to say underscore database dot roles dot to list dot select. T goes into new user role t.id, t.name, false to list. Now, in order to use this code, I'm going to have to bring in a using system.link, which will come up here at the top. Now, this code requires a little bit of explanation because it actually shows us, or actually, what am I doing? I don't want to do toList right there. I want to do as enumerable. Derp. Either one would work, but the as enumerable would be slightly more efficient. So what we're doing here is we're actually showing a slight limitation of the way Entity Framework works. The reason I have to have this as enumerable in here is because I don't want to use the iQueryable implementation of select. Now, the iQueryable implementation of select will actually turn this code into SQL and send it off to the database and then return it. The problem with that is, well, twofold. A, we don't need it because we're not filtering anything. We're just transforming data. And B, Entity Framework will throw a fit because it doesn't support us having instantiating objects with non-default constructors inside of its projections. So it would have required us to use the object initialization syntax, which is viable, but it's very verbose, and I prefer the constructor syntax in this particular case. When I say as enumerable on the roles DB set, what I'm effectively doing is I'm saying, return me all the roles in the database, but return them to me as a .NET object. So I want to refer to all the roles in the database as a .NET object in memory, which means the actual query will happen, the actual query will happen after this final to list, but we're changing the where the data is being transformed from. We're moving the data being transformed from the database to the data being transformed on our in memory, which will allow us to use the link method that'll allow us to instantiate an object with a non-default constructor. Now, this isn't any less efficient than if Entity Framework allowed us to select directly on our roles, instantiating objects with or classes without parameterless constructors. And the reason it's as efficient is because we're selecting all the roles. We're not filtering, we're not querying, we're not doing anything. We just want all of the roles. So it doesn't really make a difference that we're transforming it into an enumerable as opposed to a queryable. Finally, the second line of course will just transform our persistence entities into our view model, which is what we want. And then the final method call is .toList. .toList will force this code all to execute at this particular point. If I did not do a .toList, then the database query would actually be executed in the view. And that is very bad. We don't want to execute SQL once we get into the view. We want the controller to pull out all the data from the database. We want the controller to change the data into the way a view understands. Then we want the controller to send that data into the view. We don't want to send data into a view that will result in a database query. An example of why you wouldn't want to do that would be if one day, in this particular case, we'll only be enumerating the roles once in our view, but that might change. Let's say down the road, for some reason, the designer wanted roles to appear more than once on the view page. So what do? They loop through the roles that were provided by the controller. If the controller did not do this .toList, that would result in 2 SQL statements being generated and 2 queries being executed. We don't want a design concept of adding roles multiple places on a page to affect things like what SQL is generated to our database. So we do the toList to effectively flatten out the list and perform the query immediately before we hand execution over to the view. Okay, so that's really all we need for retrieving the role data, but now we have the problem of presenting the role data on the view. Now, the way that I'm going to go about doing this it's not necessarily trivial. It's pretty easy to set up, but the reasoning behind it isn't trivial, and I'll hopefully do the best I can to explain it in as little time as possible. But let's go ahead and first of all get the view added in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say div class equals form group. I'm going to say html.label for roles. Then I'm going to say html.editor for roles. I have actually no idea what this code is going to print out. I'm actually curious now. What is the default editor for going to do if we don't provide a user template for it? Or an editor template for it? Nothing. Well, no, there it goes. It displays our name. I guess it's displaying it as just one of the properties that it's grabbing out or something, or maybe there's a convention that it pulls the name property out from something and prints it. Either way, this is really not what we want. What we want is a list of checkboxes. Now, how do we do that? Well, the way that we extend the editor for in ASP.NET MVC is to create what's called an editor template. We're going to create an editor template for this specific view model, which will instruct ASP.NET MVC to use our custom logic to present this editor whenever we try to print out something that is a user role. And if we do an editor for over an IEnumerable of something, it'll just loop over every single object in that enumerable and print out our custom editor template. So let's see how to do that. I'm going to open up my views. I'm going to go to users, and I'm going to create a folder called editor templates. Inside of editor templates, now it's important that I name it editor templates. This is a place that ASP.NET MVC will actually look for our custom editor. And then I'm going to create a Razor MVC partial view. Now there's two more important things I need to keep in mind. The first thing is the name of the view has to correspond with the class that we're wanting to override the template for, which in this case is going to be user role. The next thing is we need to have the model declaration of our editor template be the class that we're writing a custom editor for. So in this case, user role. So effectively what we've done now is we've created a custom editor template which will replace the default behavior of editor 4 just for this class, which will allow us to keep our views very nice and clean and give us an immense amount of flexibility. Now, if you're wondering, you can use the editor template to override even built-in templates. Like let's say you want to use the jQuery UI datetime picker if you ever use an editor for a datetime. You can certainly do that, or use a different editor template, or whatever you want to do. You can always override whatever editor 4 is going to print out for a particular class. So that's really powerful. So let's go ahead and test that. I'm just going to, in my editor template, I'm just going to say, hey there. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to hit refresh. And wait 1.5 years for my server to reboot. And hey, look there. We now have our custom editor template replacing what previously was printed out by default, which in that case was the name of our role. Okay, so what does the editor template for a many-to-many relationship look like? Well, it's going to look a little scary, but hopefully I'll explain it well enough. First of all, we're going to use some bootstrap magic. I'm just going to wrap this all in a div with a class of checkbox. Then I'm going to write HTML hidden for f.role id, HTML hidden for f name. Then I want HTML label for is selected, comma, f.name, or not f.name, sorry, derp, model.name. And then HTML.checkbox, or we can just do editor for again. If I can get away with it, I will use editor for whatever I can. If I can't get away with it, in the case, for example, where we have to override the class of something, I'll be forced to use the text box and password fors. But in this case, we're using the editor for is selected button. Okay, so this looks kind of scary, but if I come over here to my page and refresh, what we'll get is an admin button, or an admin checkbox. And if we had multiple roles, they would all appear here. Now, as far as what HTML is generated, let's take a look. So this is our editor template right here. What we get out of our editor template is, first of all, the ID field is required. Okay, well, you can ignore all these data val required things because it's a hidden field. But we'll get a hidden field called roles bracket 0 bracket dot ID value of 1. So we see the ID of this role is set properly. Then we get another hidden input for our name, specifying admin. Then we get our label for our checkbox, and then we get our actual checkbox. And then finally we get our input name, roles is selected, type hidden, value equals false. This is the way ASP.NET MVC works with checkboxes. If you've ever done web development in the past, you'll know that checkboxes are a pain. But this additional element that was generated by ASP.NET MVC allows us to work with checkboxes. So what we're doing is every time we hit the Create User button, we will be posting the IDs of all of our roles and the names of all of our roles and whether or not that role is selected. The reason we do that instead of just passing in the ID of a role and whether or not it's selected is so that I don't have to re-hit the database to re-present this form if validation were to fail. So for example, if I hit Create User, we'll see that the username field is required, the password field is required, the email field is required, but look at that. Our role is still there. How did the role still get there? Well, if you remember from our users controller, our post action for create, so whenever I hit that button, never hits the database to fill in my roles. It doesn't need to. It doesn't need to because we've, in a hidden way, secretly passed along the role data from HTML back into the model binder, and then the model binder took that data, turned it back into a user role object, and then our controller sent that data to our view, which sent it to our editor template, which presented it back to us in the way that it was presented before. We can also check to see if our checkbox works by simply checking it, hitting Create User, and noticing that it is still checked. Okay, so again, this is the simplest way I could come up with for handling a many-to-many relationship, and it also demonstrates a really cool feature that we can use with editor templates. You'll notice also that this editor template is scoped to the users folder. If I wanted this editor template to be present for the entire area, I would put it into its shared folder. But we're just going to keep it in users for now, because that's where it kind of makes sense to put it. Okay, so now that we have our hidden fors for our ID and our name, our label for, I do want to explain this parameter though. You'll notice that I create a label for, and I tell it that the label is for f.selected. The reason I need that is because when I click on the label, you'll notice the browser will check the checkbox. That's because that label is for this checkbox, and our browsers pick up on that. So that's why I need that label for pointing to whatever is going to be generated for is selected. However, I don't want the actual label to say is selected. If I didn't have this second parameter in, then you'll notice right here that we have is selected instead of our role name. So that second parameter to label for allows us to override the contents of the label, which is really cool. And the logical thing to do would be to pass in the role name. So now when I refresh, we'll see that the label name is admin. Anyway, so that's all cool. Now that we have the data actually being presented in a form, we have it being posted to our user's controller, we can now write code that will actually create a user and fill in his data. So we want to fill in the username, the password, the email, and the roles. So let's go ahead and do that. Just like with our login action, I'm going to say if not model state is valid, return view form. However, I'm going to do a couple things before that. Remember, our username and email need to be unique. So instead of having the database engine crash, or not crash, but throw an error when we try to create a user with a duplicate username or email, I want to present a nice error message to the user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if database.users.any, t goes into t.username equals form.username, then model state add model error username. Usernames must be unique. Otherwise, if database.users.any t goes into t.email equals form.email, then model state add model error emails must be unique. Okay, and then if I add the model state in either of these conditions, the model state will be set to is invalid, or is valid set to false, in which case we will simply represent the user with the form, and it'll display to them those particular errors. So let's go ahead and do everything but the roles first. I'll do the roles last because we're going to be creating a separate method for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var user equals new user. Now, saying var user equals new user is going to require that I have a using statement put up top for buzzmmo.data.entities. So we say var user equals new user. We're just instantiating the class, and we're going to set email to form.email, and we're going to set username to form.username. Then we're going to say user.setPassword form.password. Then we're going to say database users add user database.save changes, and then return redirect to action index. Okay, so we instantiate the user object, we set his email, we set his username, then we set his password using the set password method so that our hashing gets updated properly. I should probably change the password property itself to have a private setter so that users are forced to use the set password method. I don't like the idea of overriding the password setter to have the logic of set password. In fact, I don't even think that'll work properly because I do believe that Entity Framework itself invokes the setter when it copies the data from the database to our entity. And if we put this logic in the setter, then things will get encrypted or hashed over and over and over again. But for now, I'll just leave it the way it is. So coming back into our user's controller, after we set the password, we add the users to the database, or add the user to the database. We save our changes, and we redirect them to the list of users. Okay, so what about roles? Well, our form has a roles property with all the roles that we're going to need. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a simple helper method because we're going to be using this method for both our create and our edit pages. So I'm going to write private void sync roles iCollection of user role. Note that the iCollection brought in system collections generic at the top of the page, or top of the file. And then I'll call this, or wait a sec, iCollection of role, sorry. We'll call this, let's call this entity roles. And then we'll have a IEnumerable of user role, and we'll call this form roles, so that we know which one got posted from the form and which one already exists. All we're going to do is we're going to say entity roles.clear, and then we're going to say for each var role in form roles.where, t goes into t.isSelected, and then we're going to simply say entity roles.add underscore database.roles.find role.id. So all this method does is it takes in an iCollection of roles for these. This is going to represent the roles on the actual user entity, and it takes in an IEnumerable of user roles, which will be passed in from the view. We first clear out all of the roles that are inside of the entity originally. Then we loop through all of the roles that were presented on the form, at least, and filter it by whether or not they were checked. If they are checked, we add that role to the user, or to this collection. However, you'll notice that we add database roles.find role.id. That's because we have to convert from the view model user role to the entity role that's represented in the database. And we do that by querying the database like this. Note that the find method is intelligent. It'll only pass a SQL query to the database if that role hasn't been previously loaded into memory yet. I will also point out that running, a variety of different SQL statements in a create or edit page is really not a bad thing. Even if you run 100 SQL queries, a second or two of lag isn't going to matter when we create or edit a user. I'm typically more conscientious of my querying or how much I query when we work with pages that should be fast, like listing all of the users or logging in or something like that. Okay, so now that we have the sync roles method, how do we use it? Well, first of all, we need to instantiate our roles to something when we create a user. So I'm going to say roles equals new list of role. Otherwise, we'll get a null reference exception when we try to sync the roles. So again, we have to instantiate some sort of list of, or some sort of object into this property. Next up, after we set the password, I'm going to say sync roles, and I'm going to pass in user.roles, form.roles. So again, passing in the entity roles and the form roles, and then we add the user, then we save our changes, then we redirect. So let's see if this works. I'm going to hit F6 to recompile the application. I'm going to come over here to my page and hit refresh. Wait a year and a half. All right, username, let's do nlac, password, bleh, email, nelson@ 3dbuzz.com. Let's make him not an admin, and let's create him. All right, so it created, it probably created that user since we haven't hooked up the user index yet, but we can verify that by looking into our database directly. So let's bring that over here, rerun this query, and we will indeed see this user. Now let's check to see if that role was added to the user, because it shouldn't have been. So let's open up our user role pivot table and still see that only our admin is an admin. So let's go ahead and add an admin user. So I'm going to come back in here to my users create form. I'm going to add another user called bleh with the password of hey and an email of blehwo.com, and I'll set him as an admin. Create user. Come back over here, check to see if he got created. He did. Check my user roles, and now I see I have an entry in my pivot table with a user ID of 11 and a role ID of 1. Well, we know the role ID of 1 is an admin, but if we go back to our users table, we can also see that the user ID of 11 is indeed the user we created. Okay, let's test one more thing. I want to make sure that my usernames and my emails are unique or being constrained to be unique. So I'll type in a username of nlac, a password of something, a password email of something, and I'll hit create user. It says usernames must be unique. That's good. Now let's try the email. So I'm going to pass in nelson@3dbuzz.com. Emails must be unique. That's good. Now let's try doing both at the same time. Create user. Usernames must be unique. Emails must be unique. And now the password is required because it doesn't persist that between posts. I do want to point out that we will actually still possibly be in a situation where we get past these two checks and still create a user. What that's going to result in is that's going to result in an exception being thrown at the driver level. Now we could try catching that and displaying a different error to the user. I'm not going to worry about that right now. That's a user experience sort of thing that I don't necessarily want to clutter this application with quite yet. We'll definitely be taking time out later in the series once we get some Unity and Photon action to clean this stuff up. But for now, I'm not going to worry about it. And for those wondering, if two people try to create the same user at the exact same time and their requests get processed at the exact same time, then both of these conditions will be true and both users will be added. However, the database itself, because it has that unique constraint on both the email and the username, will prevent that one of those changes from going through, which is what we want. I mean, we did our best to check to make sure that we're not adding a duplicate username and email, and 99.99999% of the time, these two cases will handle it. But that 0.00001% chance that we have at accidentally creating the same user twice will be prevented by the database engine itself, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so now we have our create form, so let's go ahead and create our edit form. Edit form is going to be a little different. First of all, we need to figure out what route we're going to use for editing. Now the routes I'm going to be using, I'm going to have users edit / and then an ID. So users edit and then 1 for the ID of 1, 5 for the ID of 5, and so on. Now how does this work with our router? If we go into our admin area registration, we'll see that our default route actually does support an ID parameter, which is optional, tacked on to the end of our route, which means we can add actions inside of our controllers that take advantage of this particular parameter without making any additional modifications to the code. And that is the parameter that I'm going to be hijacking to place our user ID into. So how do we write an action that takes advantage of this parameter? Well, if I come back to my user's controller and go down after create but before sync roles, I'm going to write a public action result edit int ID, and then a public action result edit int ID users edit form with an HTTP post. I kind of like creating the action pair first, even before I create the view model, so I don't forget to, well, not implement or in case I forget to implement the corresponding post action. So I like to stub them out like that. Anyway, this parameter will be filled in by the routing engine because it will pick up on the fact that we will have these additional bits tacked onto our edit. Okay, so what is our edit going to look like? Well, first of all, we need a user's edit view model. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go into view models and I'm going to create a class called users edit. Users edit is going to largely look like users create, but it's going to have some differences. And I typically like to create a create view model and an edit view model separate from each other. That's a little bit of overhead when we want to add a field or remove a field, but in my experience, it provides the benefit of us being able to do things slightly different on our edit form than our create form, and I really appreciate being able to make those differences. So if we come back into our users edit, we're going to be adding a username, an email, and a roles, because those are the three things you'll be able to edit from this form. So I'm going to say public string username. Of course, it's going to be required, and we're going to want a max length of 128. Then we'll have a public string email, which will be required, have a max length of 128, and have a data type of datatype.email address. And then we'll have a public IEnumerable of user role called roles. So those are the 3 bits of data that we're going to be able to edit on this form. Coming back into our user's controller, we can now fill out our edit code. But how? Well, what we need to do is we need to actually retrieve the user from the database and then fill out the view model with that user's data. So I'm going to say is I'm going to go ahead and say var user equals database.users.find at ID. I'm going to say if user is null, which means he wasn't found, then return redirect to action index. Alternatively, you might want to display a message to the user or return an HTTP not found, but we don't have time to set up either of those things or a custom error page, so I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to hit them back to the index if that user wasn't found. Then I'm going to say return view new users edit with an email of user.email with a username of user.username and with the roles. So what am I going to do with roles? Well, the easiest way to do this is to loop or query the database for all of the roles and then hydrate them into my user role view model and then set the isSelected boolean to true depending on if the user already has that role object present in his entity. I know that sounds rather complicated, but we can do this all on one line in a pretty straightforward way. I'm going to say underscore database.roles.toList, or let's do as enumerable again so we avoid an extra object instantiation. .select, t goes into new user role, t.id, t.name, and then for isSelected, we're going to pass in user roles contains t. And then finally, we're going to make sure we do a .toList at the end so that we flatten out this list and perform the query immediately as opposed to performing the query on the view. So in this one line, we have converted all of the roles in the database into a user role, and then we've set the user roles isSelected boolean to indicate whether the user already has that role. And that will pretty much wrap up our edit action, at least the get action, not the post action quite yet. I'm go back to the post action and I'm simply going to replace this with return view form. And the reason I'm doing that is so that we can write our view before we have to write the logic that happens when we click the edit user button. So now that what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to users and I'm going to, you know what, I'm just going to copy and paste the create file and I'm going to change its name to edit. Then I'm going to load up my edit file. So I copied and pasted the create form, which does have a lot of similarities with our edit form, but there are a few important things that we're going to have to change. First of all, the view model is no longer users create, it's users edit. Second, create user or type. Sorry about being silent there for a second. Headset cut out for a bit. But anyway, so we want to go ahead and make sure that our header is displaying the correct message. Next up, we will remove our password from our form entirely, since we will be using a separate form to change our password. And then finally, instead of saying create user on our button, I want to say update user. So now if I hit F6 to rebuild, I should be able to come back here and just refresh the page. The route that I'm going to is going to be users edit 1, which will edit the first user. And then I get an error. So there's already an open data reader associated with this connection, which must be closed first. So we're having a slight issue. And yeah, so this is actually a fun problem that we'll have with Entity Framework when doing certain things. The problem comes from my use of, let's go back to users controller. It's actually a combination of problems with this line. First of all, we're doing the as enumerable. And unfortunately, the way Entity Framework works, which unfortunately is a bit different than the way I would expect it to work, or the way in Hibernate would work, is that when we invoke as enumerable on our DB set, we are opening up a data reader on our low-level connection. Okay? So, well, I mean, that's, yeah, I mean, we have to. Well, no, it doesn't happen quite there. It happens when we do the .to list. But when we convert, I'm trying to think of the words to explain this. I wonder if the source code of this will, no, it's not going to do that. It just converts the type, doesn't it? Basically, we're opening two data readers at the same time, which is what this error message is telling us. And the way we're doing that is when this code executes, this select code executes, it's executing in memory, but the results of the database query are being streamed in to this select call as the select call is going, meaning that the enumerator or enumerable, if you imagine this as a for each loop, if you said for each var result in database.roles, let's actually write this out. Instead of using link, we'll just write this out so it's easier to explain. I'll say var roles equals new list of user role. Yeah, this will make this very clear. We'll say roles.add new user role result.id result.name, and then user.roles contains result. Let's write this above my return. Again, you guys don't type out this code. I'm just showing this to explain what this line of code does and why we get that error. Okay, so this is effectively what's going on. We're opening up a for each loop, and then we're doing a select. Now, the way Entity Framework appears to work is that when we do a for each loop, or we use the IEnumerable that's returned by the DB set, it opens up a data reader object into our connection, but it doesn't close it until it's finished streaming in the results. I suppose that the way that it does this is a good thing in certain circumstances, particularly for memory efficiency, because if we didn't do it this way, or Entity Framework didn't do it this way, we wouldn't have streaming results and it would have to buffer the entire query result before it yielded back to the for each loop. In this particular instance, though, it causes an issue. Basically, the issue is we can't invoke any queries inside of this for each loop, which translates into, for our link code, we can't invoke any queries inside of this select statement. But you might be looking at this code and be asking, well, where's the query? It doesn't look like we're querying anything. But in reality, we are. The user roles is a lazy loaded property. It's a property that's only going to be used for the first time that we access the roles. So What that means is the first iteration of this for each loop accesses user.roles, which is going to fire off another database query. And because it fires off another database query, it will fail, giving you this error. There's already an open data reader associated with this connection, because the data reader that was opened by enumerating over the roles is still active and won't become closed until the for each loop ends. So that's why I say, that's why I was struggling at the beginning to explain this, because there are multiple things at play here. It's a combination of us using the asEnumerable extension method and us using lazy loading. So what's the solution to this problem? Well, one way is we can disable lazy loading for this particular query. Another alternative is to use toList as opposed to IEnumerable. A third alternative is to force the user roles to execute its lazy loaded propertiness. Lazily loaded propertiness, that's a fun word. Before we enter this line of code. Let's go ahead and write the code in such a way that we don't lazily load roles, and then keep everything else as is, just so that I can show people an example of not lazily loading a particular property. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do that if we use the find method. So we're going to have to say database.users single or default, t goes into tid equals id, dot fetch, or whoops, we have to do the fetch before we do the single dot default. Okay, so let's not do the fetch quite yet. Single or default will return a user entity that matches this predicate if it's there, or null if it's not, and if there are more than one, it'll throw an exception. I kind of like using single or default as a sanity check when I know that the predicate that I'm passing in should only ever return 1 or 0 objects, because we shouldn't ever have a user with 2 IDs, or the same 2 IDs. So how do we prevent the lazy loading of roles? Well, there's an extension method we can use on our users DB set that will fetch the roles in the same query that was used to fetch the user. And not surprisingly, it's called fetch. Now, include. Whoops. It's called include. It's called fetch in and Hibernate, I believe. So inside of include, you'll notice that it's going to ask for a string path. Well, there's actually another overload to the include method that we can pull in that allows us to express what we want to include in a strongly typed way. And you'll see ReSharper is actually telling me about this right here. It's saying, do I want to use the method system data entity query extensions.include? And I do, so I'm going to click on this. What's that going to do? Well, if I scroll back to the top of my page, that's going to do is add a using I don't know which one it added, probably data entity. It probably added this using system data entity up here at the top. So what do we pass into include? Well, we simply pass an expression that points to the thing we want to load. So again, by using include, we will query for both the user and all of the roles that he has in one single query, as opposed to using lazy loading. And this should remove our error. And we get an edit form. And we also know that our user 1 is indeed an admin. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap up this controller, or this action, by implementing what happens when we hit the update user button. Well, basically, we're going to mostly be doing what create does. So I'm just going to rewrite that down here. I'm going to say if database users any t email equals form dot email and tid does not equal id, model state add model error, email must be unique. If database users any t dot password. T.username equals form.username, and T.id does not equal ID. I know there's a syntax error on line 73. I'll fix that in a second. Model state add model error email or username. I forgot to specify in this add model error which property I want to add the error to. In this case, the property I want to add it to is email. Then I'm going to say if not model state is valid, return view form. Then I want to load up my user. So I'm going to say var user equals database users find ID. If user is null, then return redirect to action index. I probably should have done that at the top, but eh. So then I'm going to update the user by simply saying user.email equals form.email, user.username equals form.username, and then sync user roles form roles. Then I'm going to say database save changes. And after we save the changes, we're going to return redirect to action index. Okay, so when we edit, we make sure email and username are unique. Notice the one addition I made to this this query is that I want to see if any user has the same email but isn't the user we're actually editing. Because obviously this database users any will return true if we left the email the same, which will be problematic. So in this case, I want to also make sure that we're not comparing the email with the user that we're already looking at. Then we check our usernames. Then we check to see if the model state's valid. If it isn't, we return the view again to show the errors. Then we pull in our user. We make sure it's not null. We set the email of the user, the username of the user, and we sync their roles. We save our database changes, and we redirect back to the index. So now I can hit Control or F6, come back here and refresh. So let's change the email to admin123, hit update user. Then let's open up our database, select our users, and we indeed have admin123. Let's go ahead and add nlac to the admin group. So I'm going to go to users, edit 10, and then I'm going to add them to the admin group and hit update user. Then I'm going to go back to that page and refresh, and we see that he is indeed an admin. Let's make sure that removing a role works. So I'm going to remove the role, update user, come back to that edit form, and see that indeed that is unchecked. All right, so that is our create form and our edit form. Let's go ahead and really quickly, before we hop off the video, implement our list of users so that we can see all the users that we already have. So let's jump over into our users controller, which we're already in, and let's write our index method, which we already have a stub for. So what we need to do is we need to return a list of users to the view, which means we're going to require a list of users inside of our users index. Now in this particular case, I'm not going to use a view model for my users. I will sometimes do this. I will pass in a IEnumerable of a persistence model into my views if I can make sure that all the data is indeed loaded so that the view doesn't result in a query happening, and if it's a relatively simple model. Now in the future, if there are more view concerns for our view model that we might want to address, we'll break this out. But as long as we're not editing data, I'm fine using the entity model sparingly, I guess. But in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and use that. Then inside of our index method, we'll simply say users equals database.users. And then I'm going to say database users include roles.toList. So this will load all of our users, all of their roles, and it'll return it as a flat list as opposed to returning it in as a query that would be executed in the view. So let's jump over into our index page and let's write out the code that we'll need. Basically, we're just going to be writing out a table. So I'm going to write a table with a class of table and table striped. Then I'm going to write my t-head with one row that's going to have ID, username, email, roles, and actions. Username, email, roles, actions. Then I'm going to write my t-body. And I'm going to write a for each loop. I'm going to say for each var user in model.users, tr, td user ID. Oops, come on. There you go. td user dot username, td user dot email. Then I'm going to write string dot join comma space on user.roles.select, t goes into tname, so that we get a comma separated list of roles that user is in. Then I'm going to write the actions. So the actions, I'm going to write a div class btn-group, and then I'm going to write a href url.action. Let's do the edit action first. So I'm going to say action edit with the parameters of user.id. Then inside the the class of our a tag, I'm going to write button, button extra small, button primary to make it blue. Then inside of my a tag, I'm going to write I class glyph icon dash, or yeah, glyph icon, and then glyph icon dash edit. And then in text, I'm simply going to write edit. Yeah, let's just leave it like that for now. So now I'm going to recompile by hitting F6, come over here and refresh and see if we see our users. We're going to be adding the reset password and the delete buttons also. And we see our users. We have our admin, nlac, and bleh. Let's go ahead and create a user. So I'm going to create a user called nlac2, password of whatever, test@bleh.com, see if he's not an admin, and he gets added. We can make him an admin by hitting edit, checking admin, hitting update user, and he's now an admin, and we can remove him from being an admin as well. So that's a pretty straightforward implementation of our create, edit, and list actions. Again, we'll need our reset password action as well as our delete action, but we'll go ahead and do that in the next video. So, see you guys.